Welcome everyone to SaaScast, the podcast that talks you through the steps you need to future-proof your product, whether that's building the ultimate marketing team or taking your products global. Our guests will help you grow, scale up, and work smarter. Hi, Nicholas. Thanks so much for joining us on SaaScast today.
Matt, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
That's great. So before we get started today with today's subject, I think our audience would just love to hear a little bit more about yourself and your journey to your current position and what it is about this industry in particular that kind of excites you.
Right. All right. So I think I work in SaaS B2B and have been for almost 15 years. I joined this industry basically doing sales operations at the very beginning, where the concept of revenue operations wasn't a thing. It wasn't even known or didn't exist really. And I started in sales ops at big organizations, and then started moving into customer success ops, and then marketing operations, and then slowly started pivoting into more kind of leadership and strategic roles. And then also in the meantime did part-time as an advisor and consultant. Started as a consultant and then moved into advisory. Uh, and yeah, then started moving into building revenue operations and the concept from the ground up in smaller organizations where I think the benefit is way more apparent when done correctly. And yeah, I've been doing this for a long time and really, really enjoy it.
And you've really had the full kind of breadth of the SaaS landscape by the sounds of things. You've touched on customer success and marketing as well, you said, so you've really sort of, I guess in your role, that really gives you good insight in terms of how to align your kind of function that you're working on with what everyone else is doing, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I think part of and this I think is going to be good for us to discuss later on, is the idea that revenue operations is a fairly new concept, but the central piece of it lies in consolidating the operational functions, right? But for you to be in revenue operations, you need to have experience in at least two of the three main areas in operations to then be able to say that you're fully in revenue operations. So you need to be either marketing and sales ops or sales and customer success. And the reason I say sales, because sales is in the middle. So it's usually common to see people with either marketing and sales or sales and CS. It's rare that you see people with marketing operations and customer success operations because they're at the end of the spectrum. So yeah, but I think what would be good is to first define revenue operations, right?
Yes, of course, yeah.
We can do that. There are obviously some concepts flying around. Different people have different definitions for revenue operations, but instead of defining it as the combination of sales, marketing, and customer success ops, I think what adds a bit more color to it is defining it as the optimization of the customer journey, be that internally or externally, right? Because I think it's as much as the customer feeling like a seamless journey from the moment they are a lead or interested in your product to closing a deal. It is also us working with our internal teams to make sure that they can provide the best experience to the customer the most seamless way possible, right? And that means optimizing processes internally, providing better data, better structure, and just make them be able to do their jobs more effectively, right?
Right. So it's streamlining the customer journey in a way, or that point to
Yeah.
finding the value moment. I
Yeah.
suppose. Yeah. Because a lot of SaaS companies, I suppose, they struggle with that, with having, especially when they're just starting out, actually not just getting people to engage with the product, but getting them to become paying customers is pretty hard as well, right? Like, so we're not just talking about actually getting people on your platform using it, which is tough enough, right? But then to actually get them to see enough value that they guess they contribute to your overall revenue. I mean, I suppose there's different ways, isn't there? They don't necessarily have to be subscribing to something, but am I right in thinking along that's the kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the most interesting things, I think. Obviously, it depends on the company, right? Some companies have trials, some companies give you the
Mm,
possibility to test out the product before they use. That is most of the time either companies that are inventing or starting a category, so they're trying to transform a category, um, or companies that are more B2C focused or end user, end consumer focused, where they provide a trial and all that. But even if they don't, right, you have a very common concept in B2B SaaS, which is a proof of concept, right?
mhm.
That is a non-commitment, but at the same time you're paying for it, but not as much as you would for a full subscription and all that. They're
Mm.
on the fence and still trying to figure out if it's going to be the best fit. It's going to be a match for whatever uh, problems or issues they have. So what they do is the company joins forces with the prospect to really build out something that is custom made for them, which is a proof of concept. But it's also a massive challenge because that's still not a guaranteed deal, right? So you need to make sure that the person is convinced enough to move on to a full contract with the company. But even from trial, right? Trials are even more complex because you have no assistance. Most of them have no assistance at all. So you just start and spray and pray. Try to figure out if that's something that works for you. If it doesn't, and you don't have a sort of a follow-up or an onboarding, you might eventually just lose the prospect, right? So getting those people whom are just within the platform with no real guidance or any sort of support to become a paying customer, that is a massive challenge, but something that RevOps certainly helps or aims to help bring in.
So is that about sort of showing your teams or I guess your sales, your marketing teams, like how they can present the value or how to tap into the pain points? Like, can we break down like how does that happen? How do you show them how to turn into the paying people prospects into revenue in a way? That sounds really cold, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, but I mean, especially nowadays, right? You have 150 different alternatives to for the same thing. You have options, right? But at the same time, with multiple options, it's also a bit of a complex situation to which one to pick, right? If you have two options, it's much easier to pick than if you have 50, right? It's a bit more complex. So part of the idea is if you understand your product and
yeah.
you understand who you're selling to, and you understand their primary issues or pain points, you already 70% into the prospecting game, right? Because by understanding your product, you can market it correctly. And by understanding the people that you're selling to or aiming at, and understanding why they would even search you in the first place, that is revenue operations. That helps the teams understand. And for you to get there, you have to have a massive collaboration with the product team. You need to have data around usage and adoption around your product. You must have a clear understanding of your pipeline and the use cases of your product, right? And that happens in the product market fit phase, and some of it even comes in the go-to-market fit phase, where you're still trying to figure out, you figured out the core basics of your product, but you're still figuring out how it fits within the market. So that also comes back with a lot of feedback. But also the idea of bridging the gap between all the teams, providing feedback loops, and keep on that cycle is probably the core of what revenue operations is all about, is bringing down the silos and trying to integrate everybody into the same vision.
Oh, wow, yeah, no mean feat then, right? Yeah. How do you so what does it I think sometimes, we talk about these things in like broad terms. What would your day-to-day sort of responsibilities look like in that kind of role? That's what I'm wondering. Like, say you open your laptop up, your computer up on a Monday morning, what would you be doing? Like, I'm just really interested in sort of like what are just the day-to-day tasks almost like that make up this job almost. What are you actually doing?
Okay, so we're going to have to break this down into size of organization and size of team.
Right.
because that
Okay.
varies significantly across the board. So let's say that you're in a small startup, 100 people, give or take, and you've been hired to be the first RevOps person building out the role. You have no real process, no real documentation. You have no real understanding of the customer journey. The systems are all over the place. You don't really can't really know what's going on. So the day can be very different. You can go from supporting the sales rep and helping them figure out how to do some CRM input to building the numbers that your CEO or your CRO or the VP of sales or whomever you report into needs to see in order to drive their business.
Mhm.
So this can vary from trying to figure out where the bottlenecks are in the business, right? And then saying, look, the leads are coming through, but we are not actually qualifying as quickly, right? So you would then go into the data and try to figure that out. So you're getting lots of leads, but the time to the first reply is 4 days. That's insane, right? You got a lead today, you take 4 days to contact the person for time for first touch, which is what we call it, is bizarre, right? So you need to figure out what's the delay. And then you go talk to the SDRs and trying to figure out why. And then you realize that they don't really know or have the visibility into the leads. So you need to figure out how to present that information to them in an easy way. Even if they do have the leads, then they need to then figure out how to qualify the leads.
Mhm.
So they need qualification criteria. They need to understand that there is a script, not an actual script, but an idea of what they need to kind of get from the lead in order to pass that on to account executive, right? So then you help build it out and design a qualification criteria playbook for them. And even if they do pass it along to the account executives, you need to figure out the flows, the automations. So I can keep going. It can kind of gets very, very detailed, but the point is it varies. If you're in a smaller organization and you're the only person there, you can be doing from field management in a CRM and
Mhm.
Excel to figuring out how to design the budgets for the marketing and MQLs, where to put the money in, or sitting down with a VP of sales to figure out pipeline. Like, do you have enough pipeline? Is it that we need to go back to marketing and saying that we need to up the inbound or need to increase the outbound efforts? It can vary. If you're in a larger business, that shrinks a bit. The kind of the scope and the breadth of what you're doing changes a bit just because the ideas larger businesses are more fragmented. Um, but it's not less impactful, right? Because you're still doing the same things. It just takes a bit longer to get them done, but they're the same things essentially. They just, have a larger cadence of delivery. I want to put it that way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about. Yeah. So you mentioned in the beginning that for smaller SaaSes, especially the startup stage, it's especially beneficial. Can we dig into that a little bit more? Why is this a must-have for this particular stage of growth? And how do startups benefit in particular from getting a RevOps function rolled out?
So let's put it in practical terms.
Hmm.
So we have a very common issue across, I think, all businesses, but let's focus on smaller organizations where I think this gets a bit too out of hand. Um, the handover process or the relationship between marketing and sales is usually one that is kind of fragile, if you want to put it that way. You can have a massive power play between both teams. You can have egos playing in. You can have finger pointing exercises of I generated leads, but you're not closing quickly, or you're not converting, or you're not qualifying, or actually the leads are bad. So the idea of basically bringing everybody onto the same page, on the same level, and saying, look, the amount of leads doesn't matter. It doesn't. Effectively, it doesn't. Now, we need to figure out how do we make that become revenue.
Yes.
So if it is that the lead is of bad quality, then sure, we'll deal with that. But if it is the case that we're not qualifying, we also need to understand the root cause, right? And fix the root cause. And the VP of sales or whomever leads the sales team, they're not necessarily focused on the super nitty-gritty of why things are not happening. They want the results. And usually the operational side of things is dealt by the operations team, in this case, revenue operations.
Mhm.
And so what we can do in this example is basically align the criteria in which we consider a lead, first of all,
Mhm.
or what it is that you need to do in order to convert a lead or book a meeting or make sure that that is something that is actually tangible for the account executive, rather than just passing on things that don't really make sense.
Mhm.
Align that the end goal, the revenue, is what matters, right? So
Yeah.
one of the things that I've done to kind of bring down that silo a bit is, instead of comp SDRs based on meetings booked or completed,
Mhm.
comp them on total revenue.
Mhm.
So that brings down the silos pretty quickly, significantly, because people are no longer figuring out about the quantity, but it's more about the quality, right? Because I can send things along, but if they don't get through to the end, it doesn't matter. So let me really take some time and figure this out. And that really bridged the gap in two of the organizations that I managed to fully deploy this. And the reason it's only two is because there's a pretty big barrier to implement something like this, because it is a bit aggressive, if you want. Um, but the
Let's
idea
break
of
that down a little bit as well then. Sorry to interrupt you if you want
yeah,
to
go
kind
ahead.
of point, but I think that's a really good you're giving us a really good segue there actually to go into what are the barriers. Why aren't more people doing this then? You just mentioned it being aggressive. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So the fact that if you're a person whom are in sales, right, you're really focused on your commission.
Mhm. Mhm.
And by focusing a lot on your commission, you want to get that as much as possible, as quickly as possible.
Mhm. Mhm.
And if you're an SDR, you're booked or you're comped on something that is going to be booked way further down the line, right? You book a meeting today, but it's only going to close if the sales cycle, for example, is 6 to 9 months, which is usually what you see. The SDR is only going to be comped for that deal 9 months later, if it closes,
Right.
because then they're essentially leaving it in the hands of the AE to manage to close the deal. And if they don't, and the lead was still good, they don't get comped.
Right. Yeah.
So it's aggressive because obviously it's not as simple as that, as just making it about revenue. You have to factor in a few other things. It's not just about the end revenue, it's also about the meeting booked. So there's a percentage for being able to convert that and become a lead. So it's not 100% based on the revenue, but it's a bigger percentage based on that. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, you need to be forward looking, right? You can't keep doing things based on the immediacy, right? But there needs to be a balance.
It's an interesting point about the sales goals and everything. One of the things that I've encountered, and not going to name any names of places I've worked, but this is something I've found in the past is people talk a lot about alignment, right? And finding alignment. And that sounds like it's kind of the essence of what you do in a way. But that can be so, so hard. I mean, we give people KPIs and OKRs so that they can kind of hit their targets and all this kind of thing. I think and it works, it does incentivize people, especially when there's financial incentive. But one of the problems I think sometimes is that people get very kind of tunnel visioned about it, and then it's very hard to get them to understand the pain points of other well, not even the pain points of other departments, but the broad why should I care about the broader vision is sometimes hard, I think, to get in people's head. And I wonder, how do we get there? I think that must be a really, really tough thing to do. That's a real kind of maybe a cultural change within your company a little bit, maybe. I don't know if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's not just cultural. I think it's a mindset, right? You need to hire people who are ready to think, looking at the big picture,
Mhm.
rather than just what can my team benefit from this? Because
Yes.
at the end of the day, look, you're not sure you're selling because you want the commission and all that. Fine. That's fair. I get it. But you want the company to be successful because then you get bonus, right? And in order to get the bonus, it's never 100% based on your performance, it's based on the company's performance. So that's one of the ways that the company objectively and quantifiably finds to change that culture or build that idea in. But that's not all, right? You need people to really say, look, It's great that you're trying to close a deal, and I completely get you have a number and all that, but there are several other teams that are impacted from decisions that you make, right? By
Mhm.
decisions that you make. So not having a complete picture of the financials or what it exactly that they're contracting to, if they needed specific terms agreed to and all that, and you pass the entire deal to then get to the end, and then finance realizes that there's an irregularity, or legal says, well, you can't offer that. That's completely outside the bracket. So you just wasted a lot of time,
Yeah,
and you waste a lot of people's time because now they have to not only review what you're doing, but also wait for the new one to come. So that needs to be understood, right? Because people's time is the only thing we want more of, and we can't get, right? So that needs to be
exactly.
respected regardless. So yeah, I think it's the whole idea of alignment is easier said than done. In a
Yes.
lot of the business, it's really complex to do. But I think it's a mentality from leadership, right? Is always pointing to the right direction.
Trickles
And
down. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. It takes time, but I think that's why it's so important to start thinking about it sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And for sure. And I think one of the problems as well is that as companies expand, as they grow, the newer recruits sometimes, the more you employ, the further away you get from the vision, in a way, of the founder sometimes is the problem. Like I guess like you're 100th or 102nd employee is not going to be potentially as in touch with what the broader mission statement is here. When do you see what I mean? When maybe they're not being trained by the founder, or they're not having meetings with the founder, but they're having meetings with, I don't know, whoever the head of their team is, or whatever it is, you know. And then also you've got compounding that, you've got the remote work and hybrid work situation that people are in now as well, which I think is like, for me, it's like it still seems like we're in experimental territory for that a little bit. We don't really know yet. I think people are coming to the conclusion now that it's probably a little bit of both is good. Like the hybrid model is quite good. You know, you have people in the office because having people in the room with people they're working with works really well. But also allowing that life work balance that the hybrid week gives you also helps out. But I do think that there's the danger as well of the out of the room syndrome, they call it, don't they? Can really have an impact on what you're trying to do in particular. When there are people on the team maybe that you just haven't even met, you haven't even seen, you know, like yeah,
Yeah. I mean, that is very true.
yeah,
But also something that we need to keep in mind is that companies grow, right? I don't think
yep,
I've ever met a founder or a C-level person who's said we want to keep our company exactly the same size as it is today, and that's it. Companies grow, and naturally, you get more people in to the point where you start diluting a bit your culture and all that, if not done correctly.
hmm hmm
Because if you take an example, which is very cliche, but I still think it's a good one, Apple, right? You have the vision and the passion, and you see that the employees in every single Apple store behave and talk to you the exact same way across the board, and they're not even remotely close to Tim Cook.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's so funny you mentioned that. I had that exact same conversation with the last podcast guest who came in. We were talking about how do you instill kind of good cultural values within a company. And it was the example that I used was that every time I go into the Apple store, no matter where it is, I come out feeling like glowy and special somehow. Like I don't know
Exactly.
how they do it, but it's amazing what they do there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think we all use this because I think every um, company out there tries to get to that point. Some do through products, right? You feel the exact same way when you drink, Coke, versus when you go buy an iPhone. It's that one is through product, the other one is through services, and also through product, of course. But the idea is the same, right? You permeate culture through top ranking down. It's completely top down, and that needs to be carried on. You only hire people who have this passion, or can at least be affected by that passion, right? And yeah, I think it's tough to do if you hire too quickly. and you don't really focus on what's really important in each candidate that you get in, you run into a risk of diluting that culture pretty quickly and becoming a toxic environment.
Yeah, yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. And that's really I think that's a topic that people are really in tune with at the moment is toxic work environments. You see a lot of it on LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff, don't you? How do you avoid that? Because I think we've had a big shift actually in the last couple of years in terms of people being mindful of the culture that they're creating. I don't think this is maybe a thing that people talked about as much 20 or so years ago, but I think people are really starting to realize that your day-to-day operations, things that you're talking about, revenue operations, it's so critical, that kind of thing. If you're talking about everyone communicating like you're saying, so everything runs smoothly like a well-oiled machine, there's got to be that kind of mutual respect and just a general, at least minimal sense of contentment in the role, hasn't there? Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of yeah, there's not much way around it, right? The culture is what holds everybody together. It's the glue that really keeps everybody together. And the whole idea of with the layoffs happening and all this negativity coming around, I'm more of a realist and a very objective person. So in no way, shape, or form, I think that we are irreplaceable, right? We're not. And that's just a fact. And that's okay. The moment you realize that and you just accept it, and that's it's liberating, really. But at the end of the day, the whole point is to, regardless of being irreplaceable or not, and being a number in a balance sheet, and eventually when the company really needs it, will eventually cut you off, and that's it. It's how you do it.
Mhm.
That's critical because it's a business decision. It can be super binary. I get it. But the way you do it can make it more or less traumatizing for the employee, which is at the end of the day, the person's being affected anyway, right? So that is the key thing that really shines in a really strong company culture. When
Yeah.
you don't have that, that is the time it permeates rather obviously.
Yeah, and you can't get away with it as easily now as well. I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever I've been searching for jobs in recent years, I've always gone on the Glassdoor site and had a look at, and so people have the power now to say like, look, this is not good, disgruntled. So I think sometimes people have that mindset of like, oh, wash my hands of them. It doesn't matter now, they're not with us. But I don't know. It can come back to bite you now, I think, if you don't handle the exit interview or whatever it is well, you know.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
even more, right? Because I think the exit interview is the end, right?
Yeah.
If you got there, it's because something went wrong,
Yeah.
right? Or the person, obviously not considering the person just left because they decided to leave and they got a better job offer and all that. That's fine, but we're not talking about those scenarios. We're talking about um, the people who were affected from a negative perspective, right? They can just ask past employees. I do this all the time. I ask former employees about how their experience, how it is to work there. I ask current employees. And you'd be surprised. People say, well, if asking current employees, they're always going to say good things. Well, not really,
No.
not necessarily. So yeah, I mean, I've had some good experiences where people asked me my personal opinion, and I managed to steer them clear from specific companies. And yeah, I think they then came back to me and gave me good feedback and really thanked me for it. So it's easier than ever to just talk to people and get information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really great attitude to go forward with as well. So let's move on to kind of the RevOps team then. If you're lucky to have a team rather than just a RevOps person or whatever it is. I guess again depends on the size of your organization, right? But let's sort of what does that look like? What would your team, if you have a RevOps function, what would it be made up of? How could you sort of delegate different responsibilities there? What would be the basic structure of it?
So I tend to split revenue operations for smaller scale into four different teams.
Hmm.
So you have the general operations teams, which basically help. They are serve more like business partners for the sales team, marketing team, and customer success team. Then we have the insights and analytics team. So these are usually composed of data analysts, people
Mm.
who are good at reading data, finding trends, and just crunching a lot of numbers at the same time and presenting some insights. Then you have enablement, which is extremely vital for the success or not of revenue operations. And I think everybody around it, where you basically teach people and basically capacitate people to either follow internal processes
Mhm.
and make sure that they're just being compliant with what it is that the wider go-to-market team structure is trying to go for, and selling better,
Mhm.
right? Also, that's more like the sales coach branch of revenue enablement, but
Mm.
and then systems and system administrators. So basically, it's called go-to-market systems,
Mm.
and those are the people who basically administer all of the tech stack
Mhm.
and collect feedback and kind of design whatever it is that the operations team and the go-to-market strategy team figures out to build. They go ahead and build it.
Mhm.
So that's usually where I start. Now, the priorities of those hires, that changes a lot based on the situation of the company, priorities, what it is that they're actually trying to achieve. I advised one company before where they didn't have anybody in operations, but they went straight with enablement, right?
Mm.
So they wanted someone to just kind of structure the documentation and make sure that the CRO had everything they needed to uh, basically use as reference for new hires. They were hiring pretty quickly, which is a separate issue, but we can dive that into the later. Um, and yeah, so they started with that, but some people might say, look, I don't need that. I need just to be able to start getting some ideas out of the paper and into practice. So we hire an operations team, an operations person. So it really doesn't matter as long as it makes sense to you, the situation of the business, and so on and so forth. But that's usually the four areas that I focus on.
Right, yeah. So that would be your optimal kind of structure, or does it depend on your company entirely?
It depends on the company, but usually it doesn't really deviate a lot from this. Sure, you can have some organizations have deal desk under revenue operations as well. Some are under finance, it doesn't matter. But it can also fall under revenue operations. And you have some slight variations from that. Commissions, there might be a specific commissions team,
Mhm.
usually larger businesses, but still that can also fall under RevOps. It can also fall under finance. So it's really dependent on how you're trying to shape the business and also the level of sponsorship that you're getting to do.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I want to know then, with you having done advised companies on this, then, I mean, we're not going to name any names, obviously, but can you give us a sort of best case scenario of what this looks like when it's really worked well and like, sort of give some examples of like things people have done practically to really bring this into fruition?
Okay, so one of the scenarios where I'm brought in as an advisor is to help do exactly that, build the revenue operations function
Mm.
or serve as a sounding board for the board and also the C levels to figure out it doesn't make sense? Do we have the right data? Do we have the right structure to put in place to be able to make those decisions, so on and so forth. But the common scenario is we know RevOps is good, but we don't know what it does. We need someone to help us build it. Like, great. So if from that point to perfect or ideal, I've never seen, but still have hope. I can't die. Um, but ideally, you have a leader
Yeah.
that director level, and in small companies, titles can be a bit finicky, but someone with at least 8 years or so given experience, right? Because you need time and to have exposure to all the areas to really grasp and understand what you're doing. So can't be less than that. So a leader, and then one for each one of these functions. So
Mhm.
one operations person to handle marketing, sales, and CS. You're not going to do everything well, but you're still going to be able to at least put some stop gaps and trying to figure things out, right? And scope
Mhm.
out what you need. Maybe two, maybe two. people in that area specifically. One, in enablement to start kind of putting everything into documentation, right? And start training people and being that sounding board between the teams, getting feedback from the teams, and also bringing that into the team, the revenue operations team. One person to manage the systems, because that is a real full-time job by itself. And then maybe a data analyst, someone who's not in BI, is within the RevOps team that interfaces with the BI team
Mm.
to get that data and transform that into insights. Now, the reason I say maybe is because data in smaller organizations is, putting it lightly, an issue.
Right.
Have real ways of real data to make real decisions on. So it's a bit finicky. But the idea is to build that architecture in order to start collecting data correctly to then be able to make decisions on. So that's why the data analyst is usually the last hire, because for you to do that, you need to do the foundations first. So that's the ideal scenario. And then as you grow, you add more people into it. The idea is to have a dedicated sales ops person, a dedicated mark ops person, so on and so forth. Then you have a CRM manager to then manage a team of developers and architects, for example. So you keep expanding the team, but within those reaches. Sometimes enablement might branch off from RevOps and be its own thing because the skill sets are very different, but slight variations.
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of just a case of it's a bit of experimentation as well, isn't it? It's sort of seeing like what's working for us. Well, look, build this up. Where are the gaps still existing? Okay, let's introduce this role. Maybe we don't need that. Maybe we can integrate this. It's sort of that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it really varies depending on the urgency some people have. But also I think the how far the company is in the
Mm.
product market fit phase versus the go-to-market fit phase. That does really dictate a lot about the hires that you make and also the seniority level that you go. Series A, you might not need a VP, probably not at all, really a VP revenue operations, but at a Series D, you probably need a VP of revenue operations. So it really varies a lot depending on this life cycle and the stage of the company.
Right, yeah. And why is that? Why is it that later stage you're going to require a VP? Sorry, that's a really obvious question, but I was just
Never something like that. So from a Series A perspective, you're very scrappy and you
Mm,
can get a lot done with just some Excel work, maybe, and you just get around here and there, building some things, and you can be scrappy.
mhm,
Series D, you require a level of maturity, not from necessarily just you, but your P or your VC is actually already demanding a level of maturity that you don't necessarily get in a Series A. So you need way more structure, you need way more planning, way more strategy across the board. And therefore, you need a bit more senior person to then guide you because you wouldn't expect that from a business analyst that you would in a Series A if you hired that person. But in a Series D, you require someone to tell you kind of what to do rather than just take orders and all that, which is what you usually see when you hire too junior.
mm.
Series D, you can't afford that, right? Because you're already pretty massive for the startup world, of course.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I get it now. Thank you. I mean, it sounds like an incredibly rewarding, but also incredibly complex and holistic process overall to me, I'd imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is very complex because you're dealing with a lot of people at the same time. You're dealing with a lot of different personalities. You're dealing with a lot of moving parts internally and within the business and all of that. So it can get very complex very fast. So one of the recommendations that I always give either my mentees or people whom I've worked with is take your time. Don't
Yeah.
try to do everything at the same time because it will be noticed that everything is kind of done.
Yeah.
And the credibility is something that RevOps slash sales ops, everybody in ops cannot lose because once you shatter that, it's tough to really get people behind you. So take your time, do it well, try to do it once.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of SaaScast. For more top insights from the leading minds in SaaS, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a thing.